Dad, can you mix this up for me?
Sure, I can mix it. Hey everyone, welcome back to the table. I'm Scott, and today we are going to talk about mixing up paint and paint pots and paint shakers and all the things dealing with paint. So we figured out a whole bunch of things, and we're here to share what we've learned and make your lives hopefully easier. Before we get into talking about shaking up paint or mixing paint, really what we need to talk about first is different types of paint pots. So there's a lot of different brands out there. It's really easy to get caught up in mainstream media and always going with Citadel or some other ones, but there are quite a few different paints out there. So I say use the ones that you enjoy and you're comfortable with. Now we tend to carry three main paints in our arsenal. We do enjoy Games Workshop's Citadel paint line. We also have a lot of Army Painter, and we have Duncan Rose paints, along with spattering of a bunch of other things. What are the different types of paint containers? So if we talk about the Citadel line, they like to use the flip top paints. Now these flip top paints are really useful. You can open them up, you can scoop out the paint that you want, and then put it down onto your palette, and then you can just start painting, right? After you mix it up with whatever it is that you want to do. The downside to the paint pot, it's very easy to spill. There's a lot of jokes on the internet about spilling your non-oil. So the next type that is out there is tube. You see these a lot with oil type paints, and there's a couple different paints that are out there. Tubes are really helpful because you can squeeze out exactly how much you want to use, but oftentimes when you're using these, you definitely have to water them down and change them. I personally find them a little bit harder to mix with, though you can get your exactness with it, but these are a fine way to be able to store and use the paints as well. The other kind out there is a screw top bottle. Pro Acrylic has a really good version of this. Cuttlefish also has switched over to these bottles in their newer line, especially around the time they went over to Creature Caster. And their paint bottles are really helpful because you can control how much actually goes into them. The other one that they have is a dropper bottle, and you see these pretty commonly with Army Painter. Also, you have that with Vallejo and Duncan Rhodes all have those as well. And there's a lot of other kinds. I'm not naming them all off here, but these have a dropper bottle. Now, these are my favorite. So they're really easy to be able to use for paint recipes. A lot of times you're mixing your paint together. I prefer to actually record the recipes that I'm making because oftentimes I'll paint part of an army and I need to go back, and I don't want it to be that far off from what I did before. Generally, people aren't going to know, but I want them to be as close as possible. So now that we've talked about the different types of paint pots, why do you even need to shake up your paint? Well, unfortunately, over time, your paint separates. It's an unfortunate thing. It does do it. And even if you buy commercial paints to be able to paint your house, your walls in your house, you notice that you have to shake those paints as well. And it just over time, these chemicals separate from each other. Now, there's no real prescribed method to shaking these paints. Everybody does it a little bit different. Generally, my rule of thumb is that you should be shaking the paints for about 30 seconds. Now, this highly depends on how separated the paint is, how long was it since the last time you used it. It was just a few minutes ago. You probably don't need to vigorously shake it for 30 seconds. But if you haven't used it in a month, it probably needs more of a shake. There's a lot of different tools that are out there that you can use to shake your paints. One of the best tools for any of these methods is using shaker balls. That is these right here. You can get a pack of 100 from Army Painter. And what you do with them is you pull out one of the balls and you put them inside of your paint bottle, and this makes it easier to agitate the paint inside. So you can generally get the mixing balls for about $5 to $7 depending on where you're getting them from. You can additionally do this if you have a glass bead. One of the things I would avoid is using just a random piece of metal from the hardware store or they have laying around. What you don't want to have happen is have your mixing ball to rust inside of your paint. Now, there are some brands that automatically come with shaker balls inside of them. Method number one for shaking the paint is probably the simplest method and the most accessible method, and that's shaking it by hand. And so you're simply going to take the thing and you're going to shake it from side to side or back and forth, either way, until it's shaken up. From a price perspective, using the handshake method is the cheapest way, simply because you just need to do the work. So one of the other things that you can do to shake up your paints is using a homemade device. One of the ones that we found that worked really well and that we used almost immediately after starting in the hobby is the jigsaw method. Now, jigsaw is when you pull the trigger on it, the blade goes up and down, back and forth, and it naturally does the motion that you would do as if you're doing it by hand. So you can take the blade and adhere some type of device to it to hold your paint pot and use that to shake it up. A couple examples, and this is the first iteration we had, is that we used a small clamp and we attached it to the blade. And so you would use this and pinch your pots together. So it would work very similar to this. You'd cram your pot into there. You'd use the clamp to push this together as close as possible. And then you would, from there, you would load it into the jigsaw. So now it's attached, and you would use this to shake your paint. This actually works pretty well, but part of the problem that happened with this is, one, bolts that you're using or however you're adhering to it eventually loosen up, and next thing you know, your paint pot goes flying and you have to fix your device. The other more common problem is that you never really get the center of balance completely right with this portion here, and more times than not, your pot ends up falling off, or you pinch it so much that you like cramp the bottle, and then it just is awkward from there. It just continues to devolve over time. So quickly after using this method, we upgraded to a better version of this, and that is with a 3D printed paint shaker. So this one works out pretty well, and I'll have links for this below if you wanted to do the same method. It's basically a cup, and you put your paint inside of here, and then there's a rubber band that attaches through the portion of it and keeps the top in. The other good part about it is there's a clamping function that's right here that you can use a couple small bolts and clamp it together and prevent this from coming out. Now, the downside to these is, as we mentioned before, I have children that are painting with us, and I don't feel comfortable letting them use a jigsaw to be able to mix the paints up. For the jigsaw, the good news about this method is it's relatively inexpensive, assuming that you already have a jigsaw. Jigsaws can run anywhere from $30 to $100+. It all depends on what you do. This particular one I've had for a while, and I use it to be able to do a lot of home improvement and crafting type projects. So I happen to already have this. So it was just the time to buy blades or use an old one is what I did here. And then I had to either buy a clamp or 3D print the cup that works. Now again, if you have these things available, then it's really just putting together the tools and being able to do it. However, if you don't have these, then you would have to invest. And in that case, I probably wouldn't recommend this method. The next method that I've found to be able to shake paints is by using some type of device like this paint shaker. Now this is one of the first ones that I tried, and honestly I wasn't really impressed. What you do is you actually take your paints and you set them into this portion right here, and then you take this little rubber strap that goes over the top of it and you lock it into place. And once you push that button, then the paint will shake back and forth. And that seems like it would work just fine, but what I've found is that more times than not, the rubber band actually comes off, or the paint just isn't shaken up, because the motion for this device, when it goes back and forth, is very subtle. Now, from a cost perspective, this thing was relatively inexpensive, a lot cheaper than getting maybe a higher grade paint shaker. The last method that I want to talk about today for shaking your paint is actually using a Vortex mixer. I managed to go into one of our local game shops, and they had some sitting at the painting desk. I tried it and instantly fell in love with it. It mixes the paints very quickly. The downside is it cost a few dollars. For this one in particular, when we got it, it costs about $120. However, if you compare that to the jigsaw method and you don't actually have a jigsaw, then that's about the same price potentially, depending on what type you get. Also, the other thing that I like about this is it's something that the kids can use as well when they are mixing paints. Now, the downside to this thing, and the thing I don't like about it, is if you're using it, if you're prolonging the use, then it can really cause your hand to get a little what I'll call fuzzy. Now in that case, that could be a sign of some potential nerve damage or other issues if you're using this over a prolonged period of time. If I know I'm going to do a big session, then one of the things I tend to do is I'll come down and pre-mix some paints throughout the day. The other thing that I tend to do with these Vortex mixers is that I use my offhand for mixing the paint, meaning that I'm left-handed and I paint left-handed, so I'm not using my left hand to shake up the paint. I don't want my hand to have the jitters potentially. While I'm actually painting, I'll use my right hand to mix up the paint with. That way I can keep my hand steady and focused while I'm doing my painting session. Thanks for hanging out with me while we talked about shaking our paints. If you have any questions or issues, let me know down in the comments. If you manage to find a product that works really well, let me know down below. I would be happy to pick it up and give it a try. I'm always on the lookout for things that work better than what I already have. If you've watched our video on how to use your space, you know that we are always evolving, changing, and moving things around. And so that comes with getting better tools constantly as well. So feel free to share those types of things down below. And until next time, when we see you at the table.